Morgan Freeman confronts a rude talk show host. His response leaves the audience speechless. The air in the studio was electric, a kind of energy that buzzed just beneath the surface, making the audience shift in their seats with anticipation. Every seat was taken, and even backstage, the crew exchanged glances, aware that tonight's guest was no ordinary celebrity. As the theme music faded, applause surged through the room, a rolling wave that seemed to shake the walls. People leaned forward, eyes bright, some even clutching the edges of their seats. They weren't just watching, they were waiting, eager to soak in every word from the man about to step into the spotlight. And then, Morgan Freeman walked onto the stage. At 86, he moved slower than he used to, but his presence was as commanding as ever. The applause grew louder, almost deafening, and a few people in the audience wiped at their eyes, overwhelmed by just the sight of him. His deep, warm voice filled the air as he greeted them, smooth and steady, carrying the weight of decades of wisdom and stories untold. He smiled that familiar, gentle smile, one that had narrated countless lives and legends, and the crowd responded with a standing ovation, some cheering, others unable to do more than clap, wide-eyed and awestruck. Morgan chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to calm the room instantly, and gestured for them to sit. Even then, the applause lingered, a reluctant ripple that faded slowly, like a song ending too soon. As he settled into the chair across from the host, he exhaled, his hands resting comfortably in his lap, eyes bright and unhurried. The stage lights reflected softly off his gray hair, and for a moment, everything else, the cameras, the lights, the millions watching from home, seemed to fade. But not everyone shared the audience's admiration. The host, Vanessa Clark, leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her fingers tapping lightly on the cards in her lap. Known for her sharp tongue and ruthless approach, Vanessa's gaze was focused, almost predatory. Morgan's eyes flicked to her, catching the subtle tension in her posture, the slight curve of her lips that suggested this would be no ordinary interview. He returned her look with a small smile, calm and unbothered, as if he could already see where this was headed. The audience, still buzzing from the excitement of his entrance, hadn't noticed the chill creeping into the room. But Morgan had. He could feel it, that slight shift in energy, the kind that came just before a storm. His eyes twinkled knowingly, but he said nothing, content to wait, to let her make the first move. The stage lights gleamed, the cameras zoomed in, and somewhere in the control room, a producer gave the signal. The interview had begun. Vanessa's smile sharpened, eyes glinting with the thrill of the game she was about to play. She leaned in, just enough to close the space between them, her fingers still drumming softly on the cue cards. The audience shifted, some exchanging glances as if they, too, could sense the edge in her posture. Vanessa Clark was known for her interviews, never gentle, always bold, and sometimes brutal. She had built her career on questions that cut deep, ones that left even the most seasoned celebrities scrambling for words. Tonight, it seemed, would be no different. Without wasting a second, Vanessa let the first question fly, her tone smooth but the words razor-sharp. "At your age," she began, voice carrying clearly across the studio, "do you ever wake up wondering if today might be your last?" The effect was instant. A hush fell over the room, the kind that prickled across the skin and made hearts beat a little faster. A woman in the front row inhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her mouth. A young man near the back blinked, brows furrowing in disbelief. The collective intake of breath was almost audible, a ripple of shock that swept through the audience. Even backstage, a cameraman hesitated, fingers faltering on a button, as if half expecting someone to call for a break. But Morgan, he didn't flinch. He didn't shift or blink or show even a flicker of offense. Instead, he chuckled, a warm, low sound that melted through the tension like sunlight breaking through clouds. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and he leaned back a little, folding his hands comfortably in his lap, as if they were discussing nothing more controversial than the weather. That faint smile stayed, patient and unbothered, as if he had heard this all before, and found it, at most, mildly amusing. Vanessa's smile tightened, the corners of her mouth twitching when her question failed to land the way she'd intended. For just a moment, her eyes narrowed, so slightly that only those watching very closely would notice. But Morgan saw it. Of course, he did. His gaze held hers, steady and knowing, with the kind of patience that made it clear he was in no hurry. That alone seemed to unsettle her, just a little. Undeterred, Vanessa forged ahead, her smile widening to cover the crack in her composure. "You've played God," she pressed, her tone almost playful now, though the words were anything but. But let's be real, you're just a man. A very old man. What's it like knowing your time is almost up? This time, the gasp was louder, sharper, and some in the audience turned, eyes wide, as if seeking reassurance that they hadn't just imagined those words. An elderly woman near the front gripped the armrests of her seat, eyes glistening with disbelief. A young couple a few rows back exchanged a glance, uneasy, almost nervous. Even the stage lights seemed a touch too bright, glinting off Vanessa's earrings as she leaned in, waiting, her eyes never leaving Morgan's face. Morgan took a breath, slow and unhurried, the kind that seemed to settle the very air around him. He looked at Vanessa, eyes warm but sharp, carrying a weight that words alone couldn't hold. For a moment, it seemed he might answer directly, might give her the response she was clearly fishing for. But instead, he tilted his head just slightly, his smile softening into something almost sympathetic. "Well, Miss Clark," he said gently, voice deep and rich with a calm that bordered on dangerous, "have you ever sat beside someone as they took their final breath?" The question hung between them, heavy and unexpected, a sudden drop into deeper waters than Vanessa had intended to tread. Her smile faltered, eyes widening for just a heartbeat before she caught herself. "Well, she started, but Morgan didn't wait for her to finish. "I have," he continued, voice soft but carrying effortlessly through the silence. "Many times." Another hush fell over the room, heavier this time. Even the cameras seemed to hold still, the red recording lights steady, capturing every breath, every flicker of expression. The audience barely moved, some leaning forward unconsciously, drawn in by the quiet power of his words. In the front row, the elderly woman's eyes glistened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A young man swallowed, throat bobbing, eyes fixed on Morgan's face. Morgan's gaze didn't waver, didn't shift from Vanessa's face as he spoke, voice steady, almost gentle. "I have held the hands of dear friends as they spoke their last words," he said, each word measured and precise, carrying a weight that left the room breathless. "I have watched remarkable men and women take their final breaths. And do you know what they regret the most?" Vanessa blinked rapidly, her hands tightening around her cue cards, knuckles paling slightly. For the first time since the interview began, she didn't seem to have a response ready. The audience was deathly silent, every eye fixed on the stage. Morgan leaned in just a bit, not enough to seem aggressive, but enough to make the space between them feel suddenly very small. "They never longed for more money or more fame," he continued, voice soft but unyielding. "They wish they had loved more, forgiven more, cherished life more." A murmur fluttered through the audience, soft and unsteady, and someone near the back sniffled quietly. Vanessa's eyes darted briefly to the crowd, catching the glint of tears on more than a few faces, and her lips parted as if to steer the conversation back to regain control. But Morgan's eyes were still on her, steady and piercing, and she hesitated, mouth snapping shut. He smiled then, but there was no humor in it, only a kind of sadness, tempered with something softer, almost pity. "You ask me what it feels like to be old," he said, voice a touch quieter now, though every word still carried clearly. "It feels like a privilege denied to many." The words were a spark in dry grass, and the room seemed to ignite. Applause erupted, raw and unpolished, some rising to their feet without realizing it. A young woman buried her face in her hands, shoulders trembling. An older man near the aisle blinked hard, jaw tight, and clapped slowly, reverently, as if each motion carried more than just approval, as if it was a thank you. Vanessa swallowed, throat bobbing, her knuckles white around the cards. For just a second, she seemed to deflate, shoulders dropping a fraction, eyes flickering with something that might have been guilt, or maybe something softer. But then she took a breath, pasted on that bright, sharp smile again, and leaned forward, already moving on, already trying to wrest control of the interview back into her hands. But no one was looking at her. Every eye was still fixed on Morgan, every ear straining to catch his next words, hearts still beating hard with the truth he had just laid bare. Vanessa's smile was fixed, a little too bright, a little too tight, but she pushed forward, determined to regain control. The applause was still fading, but she leaned in, eyes sharp and voice smooth, as if Morgan's words hadn't left the entire room, breathless just moments before. She tapped her cue cards lightly, the edges bending under her fingertips, a small tell of her impatience. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression, and for a heartbeat, The only sound was the soft hum of stage lights and the audience shifting uneasily in their seats. "You've played God," Vanessa said, her voice almost playful, though the question was anything but. "But in reality, you're just a man. A very old man. What's it like knowing your time is almost up?" The words sliced through the air, cold and blunt, and this time the reaction was immediate. A woman in the front row gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. An elderly man further back flinched as if struck, his jaw tightening. Even backstage, a few crew members exchanged wide-eyed glances, one of them mouthing, "Did she really just say that?" Morgan's eyes never left Vanessa's face. He stayed perfectly still, hands relaxed in his lap, posture straight and unbothered. If her words had rattled him even a little, he didn't show it. Instead, he let the silence stretch out, unhurried and heavy, until Vanessa's confident smile began to waver at the edges. The audience seemed to hold its breath, a collective stillness settling over the room, and even Vanessa's fingers stopped drumming, frozen halfway through a tap. Then Morgan chuckled, a soft, deep sound that seemed to melt the tension just a bit, and the corners of his eyes crinkled warmly. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slow and steady, and for a moment he looked almost amused. As if he were watching a child throw stones at a mountain, more bemused than bothered. Vanessa blinked, thrown by his reaction, her eyes narrowing a fraction. She opened her mouth to press again, to seize the upper hand before it slipped completely, but Morgan's voice cut through the air, calm and unhurried. "Miss Clark?" he said, voice smooth and steady, each word rolling out with that familiar, comforting warmth. "Have you ever sat beside someone as they took their final breath?" The question was quiet, almost gentle, but it landed like a thunderclap. Vanessa's mouth snapped shut, eyes widening for just a heartbeat, before she caught herself. "Well, she stammered, but Morgan's gaze held hers, patient and unflinching, and he didn't wait for her to find the words. "I have," he continued softly, the weight of each word settling over the room like a blanket. "Many times." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that pressed against the ears and made hearts beat a little faster. Someone near the back sniffled quietly, and a woman in the third row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, fingers trembling. Even Vanessa, who was rarely at a loss for words, faltered, her eyes darting to the audience, then back to Morgan, as if searching for a lifeline and finding none. Morgan's gaze softened, his eyes warm and reflective, carrying a kind of sadness that wasn't bitter but accepting, like someone who had made peace with the inevitable a long time ago. His voice lowered a touch, and the audience leaned in instinctively, drawn to the quiet power in every syllable. "I've held the hands of friends as they spoke their last words," he said, eyes distant for just a moment, as if remembering each face, each final breath. "And do you know what they regret the most?" Vanessa swallowed, her fingers tightening around the cue cards until they crinkled softly, but she didn't answer, couldn't seem to find the words. The audience hung on every breath, some dabbing at their eyes, others staring unblinking, afraid to miss a single moment. "They never wish for more money or more fame," Morgan continued gently. "They wish they had loved more, forgiven more, spent more time with those they cared about." His eyes met Vanessa's again, steady and kind, and for a second, she looked almost small under the weight of his gaze, her confident smile slipping at the edges. Morgan smiled faintly, something almost like pity softening his eyes. "You ask me what it feels like to be old," he said quietly, voice warm and patient. "It feels like a privilege denied to many." The words seemed to resonate, echoing in the silence, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then applause burst forth, raw and heartfelt, filling the room and drowning out the soft hum of stage lights. Some stood without realizing it, clapping through their tears, faces streaked and eyes bright. An elderly man near the aisle wiped at his face, his shoulders shaking quietly. Vanessa stared at Morgan, lips parted but no words coming, her hand still clutched tightly around her cue cards. The control she had held so confidently at the start of the interview was slipping, crumbling between her fingers. And for the first time, her eyes flickered with uncertainty. But Morgan, he just smiled that warm, patient smile, as if to say that it was all right, that he had all the time in the world. The applause was still echoing softly when Morgan leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, eyes fixed gently on Vanessa. The warmth in his gaze was steady, unthreatening, but it held a weight that made the room fall silent again. The kind of silence that buzzes with anticipation, that presses down on shoulders and stops breaths short. Vanessa's fingers trembled just a bit where they gripped the cue cards, the edges crinkled and bent from her tightening hold. For a moment, she seemed to struggle for words, her smile strained and faltering, eyes darting to the cameras, to the audience, anywhere but Morgan's face. But Morgan didn't rush her. He waited, patient and unbothered, and when Vanessa finally drew a breath to speak, he spoke first, voice low and warm. "You ask me what it feels like to be old," he said softly, the words rolling out, slow and steady, each one finding its mark. "It feels like a privilege denied to many." The room seemed to exhale as one, a hushed breath that swept through the audience, some of whom had been sitting so still it was as if they'd forgotten to breathe at all. A woman near the back clutched her husband's arm, eyes shimmering, and an elderly man in the front row dabbed at his cheeks with a trembling handkerchief, lips pressed tight. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, red lights blinking almost uncertainly, as if the scene unfolding didn't belong on a talk show stage, but in some quiet, sacred place meant only for those who could truly understand. Vanessa's smile slipped entirely, leaving her mouth parted, eyes wide and startled. Her hands fumbled slightly with the cards, nails catching on the edges, and for once, she didn't seem to have a sharp reply waiting on her tongue. Her gaze flickered to the control room, to the producers gesturing wildly behind the glass. But she couldn't seem to tear her eyes away from Morgan, couldn't seem to fill the silence with anything but the soft rasp of her own breathing. Morgan's eyes softened, the corners crinkling with something that looked almost like pity, but was gentler, kinder. He leaned back a bit, sighing, and his gaze drifted, as if seeing something far beyond the bright lights and wide-eyed audience. Something quieter and softer and infinitely sadder. "I've watched a lot of good people leave this world," he said quietly, voice carrying effortlessly through the silence. "Friends, family, strangers who became friends in those last few moments. I've held their hands and listened to their final words, their regrets." A soft sob broke somewhere in the middle rows, muffled quickly, but the sound lingered, raw and unashamed. Vanessa's eyes darted to the source instinctively, catching sight of a young woman with her face buried in her hands, shoulders trembling with quiet sobs. More sniffles followed, scattered and soft, and in the control room, a producer stared at the monitors with wide eyes, headset slipping slightly. "They never spoke about money," Morgan continued, voice warm and even, "or fame, or the things they owned. None of that mattered in the end." His eyes flicked back to Vanessa's, and for a moment she seemed to shrink under the weight of that gaze, her shoulders inching inwards. All they ever spoke of were the people they loved, the time they wished they'd spent better, the words they should have said while they had the chance. His voice wavered just a bit, roughened at the edges with something old and aching. The audience clung to every word, eyes glistening, and even the cameramen seemed to hesitate, hands loose on controls as if afraid to break the moment. Vanessa's hands shook where they gripped the cards, knuckles pale and fingers twisting absently at the bent edges. Her eyes were bright, glistening too much under the stage lights, but she blinked rapidly, forcing her chin up, jaw tight. Morgan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that felt more like a sigh. "So when you ask me if I fear the end," he said softly, "the answer is no. I don't fear leaving this world, Miss Clark. I fear leaving it without making sure the people I love knew just how much I loved them." A woman in the second row let out a broken sob, and somewhere near the back, a young man scrubbed roughly at his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket, shoulders hunched. The applause started slow, scattered at first, as if no one wanted to break the spell, but then it grew, a wave of sound that crashed through the silence, raw and aching and real. People stood without realizing, clapping through tears, some pressing hands to their mouths, others reaching instinctively for the person beside them. Vanessa's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked down, then quickly back up, eyes darting between Morgan and the audience, her breath shallow and uneven. Her fingers trembled visibly, and for a moment, it seemed like she might say something, anything, just to fill the silence pressing in. But then her eyes met Morgan's, warm, steady, patient, and the words died on her tongue. Morgan smiled, gentle and understanding, as if to say it was all right, that silence wasn't always a bad thing. That sometimes, The words left unsaid spoke louder than anything else ever could. Vanessa took a shaky breath, her fingers still tight around the cue cards, edges bent and crumpled. The applause was fading, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before, and her eyes darted to the control room, catching sight of frantic gestures from the producers behind the glass. She straightened her shoulders, drawing herself up with a forced smile that barely touched her eyes. It was clear she was scrambling now, grasping for something, anything, that could turn the tide back in her favor. Her gaze flickered over Morgan, still seated calmly across from her, eyes warm and steady, hands resting comfortably in his lap. There was no impatience, no irritation, only that quiet, unshakable presence that seemed to fill the room and leave no space for anything else. Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly, and she flipped through the cards with brisk, almost jerky movements, as if hoping to find a question sharp enough to cut through the spell Morgan had cast. Her eyes landed on a card, and her lips curved into a smile that was all teeth, bright and brittle. "Let's talk about your past," she said, voice smooth but carrying a pointed edge. "Your father left when you were just a boy, didn't he? And your mother worked as a cleaner to support you? Tell me, Morgan, do you ever resent having to fight so much harder than most?" The words were blunt, dropped with a kind of casual cruelty that left the audience wincing, some leaning back in their seats as if the force of it might reach them. A young woman near the front gasped softly, eyes wide and mouth parting in shock. An older man in the back row pressed his lips together, gaze flickering between Vanessa and Morgan with something like disbelief. Even one of the cameramen faltered, his hands slipping on the controls, causing a brief shaky frame before he steadied himself. But Morgan, he didn't flinch, didn't even blink. If anything, his eyes softened a fraction, the faintest smile curving his lips. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed to melt through the tension, and leaned back a little, one hand rising to rub thoughtfully at his chin. Vanessa blinked rapidly, thrown by his reaction, fingers twisting tighter around the cue cards, eyes narrowing slightly. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the soft hum of lights and the quickened breaths of the audience, eyes darting nervously between the two. Morgan exhaled slowly, gaze drifting for a moment, eyes distant and reflective, as if he were seeing something far away, something softer. Then his eyes met Vanessa's again, warm and clear and unbothered, and he smiled, a small, sad sort of smile, but genuine all the same. "Resent it?" he repeated gently, voice smooth and even. "No, Miss Clark, I thank them." The audience stilled, some blinking rapidly, others leaning in instinctively, drawn to the warmth in his voice, the quiet strength behind the words. Vanessa's eyes narrowed further, lips pressing thin, but she didn't speak, didn't seem to trust herself to. Her fingers twisted sharply at the cards, knuckles paling, but Morgan's eyes remained soft and steady, unthreatening, patient. "My father," Morgan continued, voice carrying effortlessly through the silence, "he taught me something important. He showed me exactly the kind of man I didn't want to become." His eyes glinted with something almost like amusement, but it was gentle, without a trace of bitterness or blame. Vanessa's lips parted, but no words came out, her throat working around a reply that refused to form. "And my mother," Morgan went on, voice dipping lower, roughened at the edges with something old and aching, "she taught me how to survive." His eyes softened further, the faint smile lingering, and the audience seemed to inhale as one, breath shaky and uneven. Somewhere in the middle rows, a woman let out a choked sob, pressing a hand to her mouth, shoulders trembling. The young man near the back rubbed a hand roughly over his eyes, head ducked and jaw clenched tight. Vanessa stared at Morgan, eyes wide and unblinking, the cards trembling faintly in her white-knuckled grip. Her lips parted, but she closed them quickly, biting down, eyes darting to the audience, to the cameras, to anywhere but Morgan's face. But the cameras were fixed on her, on the slight tremble in her hands, the way her eyes glistened too brightly under the stage lights. Morgan smiled a little wider, eyes crinkling at the corners, and his voice softened further, like a father speaking gently to a frightened child. "You see, Miss Clark," he murmured, "pain is a teacher, and it taught me well." The words were a spark in dry grass, and the room seemed to ignite. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing, swelling into a wave of sound that filled the studio, raw and unpolished. Some stood without realizing it, clapping through tears, faces streaked and eyes bright. An elderly woman near the front wept openly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and a young man a few rows back gripped the armrest, eyes red-rimmed and glistening. Vanessa swallowed thickly, her throat working, eyes darting helplessly to the control room, to the producers gesturing wildly, but there was no direction to be found, no escape. Her hands trembled, cue cards slipping slightly, and for a moment she looked almost small, eyes bright and glassy, shoulders inching inward. Morgan's gaze stayed warm and steady, patient, understanding, and the faint smile lingered as if to say it was all right, that sometimes breaking was the first step to healing. Vanessa's hands were still trembling, fingers clutching the cue cards like a lifeline, but her eyes were fixed on Morgan, wide and glassy under the bright stage lights. The applause had settled into a heavy silence, the kind that prickled along the skin and made the room feel too small, too quiet. Even the audience seemed to hold its breath, eyes bright with tears and faces streaked but unable to look away. Vanessa's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking sharply, and she blinked rapidly, a touch too fast, as if trying to steady herself, to build some kind of wall against the warmth and truth in Morgan's eyes. Her smile was brittle, all edges and no warmth, and her fingers twisted tighter at the cards, nails pressing crescent-shaped dents into the paper. She took a breath, quick and shallow, and her eyes flickered to the control room, catching sight of the producers gesturing frantically behind the glass. Their mouths moved silently, urging her forward, pushing her to regain some semblance of control, to steer the interview back into familiar waters. Vanessa's throat bobbed, and she drew herself up, shoulders stiff, lips curving into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So," she said, voice a touch too bright, a touch too forced, cutting sharply through the silence. "You've had a long career, an impressive one." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the corners of her mouth twitching with something that wasn't quite a smile. "But tell me, Morgan," she pressed, each word precise and pointed, "what do you think people will remember about you when you're gone?" The question dropped into the silence with a dull, heavy weight, and the audience flinched collectively, some gasping softly, others exchanging wide-eyed glances. An elderly woman in the third row pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes glistening, and a young man near the back shook his head slightly, lips parted in disbelief. Even the cameraman hesitated, hands faltering briefly on the controls before steadying, red lights blinking unsteadily. It was a question meant to cut deep, meant to unsettle, to push him off balance, to wrest back control of a conversation that had long slipped from Vanessa's grasp. But Morgan, he didn't flinch. He didn't lean back or blink or even look surprised. If anything, his eyes softened a fraction, the faintest smile curving his lips, patient and unbothered. He chuckled softly, a warm, low sound that melted through the tension, and for a moment, Vanessa's eyes narrowed further, lips pressing thin as if frustrated that her words had failed to land the way she'd intended. Morgan exhaled slowly, fingers drumming lightly on the armrest, and leaned forward a bit, his eyes fixed steadily on Vanessa's, warm and clear and unflinching. His smile widened a touch, almost pitying but gentle, and his voice was soft and smooth, carrying effortlessly through the silence. "Ah," he said quietly, eyes twinkling with something almost amused, "but you're asking the wrong question, Miss Clark." Vanessa blinked, her smile faltering abruptly, eyes flickering with something startled, something almost frightened. "What do you mean?" she stammered, voice a touch too high, too quick, fingers twisting sharply at the cue cards. Morgan's eyes held hers, warm and steady, and his smile softened. "The real question," he murmured gently, voice low and unhurried, "is, what will they remember about you?" The silence that followed was instant and absolute, a heavy, breathless hush that seemed to press against the walls, to fill the space between heartbeats. The audience gasped collectively, a sharp, almost painful sound, and some leaned forward instinctively, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths parted in shock. A young woman in the front row slapped a hand over her mouth, eyes shimmering with disbelief, and an elderly man near the back let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head slowly, awestruck. Vanessa's face went pale, all the color draining in an instant, her eyes wide and lips parted soundlessly, words dying on her tongue. Her hands trembled violently, the cue cards slipping slightly, corners crumpling and folding beneath her white-knuckled grip. She stared at Morgan, eyes wide and glistening, breath shallow and unsteady, and for a heartbeat she looked almost small, almost breakable under the weight of his words. The quiet truth that had cut sharper than any question she'd thrown at him. Morgan's eyes softened, the faint smile still lingering, and he leaned back slowly, hands folding comfortably in his lap, gaze never wavering from Vanessa's face. His voice was soft but steady, warm and unthreatening, each word slow and measured, carrying effortlessly through the silence. "You see, Miss Clark," he said gently, "I've spent my life telling stories, helping people feel, helping them understand. And when my time is up, I know I'll leave something meaningful behind." The audience exhaled collectively, some sniffing softly, others dabbing at eyes with sleeves and tissues, shoulders trembling. A young man near the back let out a shaky breath, scrubbing at his face, and an elderly woman in the second row wept openly, hands clasped tightly in her lap, tears streaming freely. Morgan's eyes glinted softly, almost sad, and his voice dipped lower, almost a murmur. "But you," he continued quietly, gaze steady and unflinching, "you have a powerful platform, and yet you use it to tear others down." His eyes softened further, and his smile turned sad. "But it's not too late," he added softly. "You can still choose a different path." Vanessa's breath hitched sharply, eyes glistening and lips trembling, and a tear slipped free, trailing slowly down her cheek, glinting silver under the stage lights. She stared at Morgan, lips parting soundlessly, and for the first time, her eyes didn't hold anger or defiance, only raw, naked fear and something deeper, something broken and aching and terribly, terribly human. The tear on Vanessa's cheek trembled for a moment before slipping free, glistening under the stage lights. Her eyes were fixed on Morgan, wide and shimmering, her breath shallow and uneven. The cue cards in her hands trembled, the edges bent and crumpled, and her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, Vanessa Clark, who had built her career on cutting questions and sharp smiles, was silent, her walls crumbling quietly beneath the weight of Morgan's words. The audience, too, was still, the kind of stillness that buzzed with held breaths and glistening eyes. Faces turned to Morgan with a kind of reverence that belonged more to churches than talk shows. Morgan's eyes were warm, steady, never leaving Vanessa's face, and his smile was gentle, almost sad. He waited a moment, letting the silence settle, unhurried and patient, and then he leaned forward a bit, hands folded comfortably in his lap. His voice when he spoke was soft but clear, each word carrying effortlessly through the room, smoothing the jagged edges of the silence. "Life," he said slowly, the warmth in his voice wrapping around the words, "isn't measured by the years we live, but by the love we give." The words hung in the air, simple and unadorned, but heavy with a truth that left the room breathless. The elderly woman in the second row let out a choked sob, pressing a hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. A young man near the back scrubbed at his face with his sleeve, shoulders trembling. A mother near the aisle pulled her child closer, pressing a kiss to his hair, eyes glistening. For a moment, no one moved, the silence deep and aching, and then, almost as if a spell had broken, the applause began. It started slow, hesitant, but grew quickly, swelling into a wave that crashed through the room, raw and unpolished. People stood without realizing, clapping through tears, faces streaked and eyes bright. Some wept openly, unashamed, hands pressing to mouths, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. An elderly man near the back pulled out a handkerchief, wiping at his eyes with a trembling hand, lips pressed tight. Even the cameramen paused, hands slipping from controls, eyes glistening as they stared at the stage, at Morgan, at Vanessa, at the tear glinting on her cheek. Vanessa's eyes shone, lips trembling, and she blinked rapidly, but the tears came anyway, slipping silently down her cheeks. Her hands slackened, the cue cards slipping to her lap, and for once there was no mask, no smile, only wide, glistening eyes and a breath that hitched softly, unevenly. She stared at Morgan, lips parting as if to speak, but the words never came. Her voice caught somewhere between her heart and her throat. Morgan smiled faintly, eyes warm and understanding, and he nodded. Just a bit, a small, gentle gesture, as if to say it was all right, that sometimes silence was enough. He rose slowly, movements careful and unhurried, and turned, his eyes drifting over the audience, over the tear-streaked faces and glistening eyes, the hands pressed to mouths and chests. The applause swelled, a thunderous wave that shook the walls, that seemed to fill every crack and corner of the room, unending and unbroken. He walked off the stage slowly, head held high, shoulders straight, leaving behind a room of people forever changed, a lesson in grace and wisdom lingering in the air like a song that refused to end. The stage was empty now, but Morgan's words lingered, heavy and warm, filling the silence he left behind. The applause had faded, leaving only soft sniffles and hushed murmurs, and for a moment, no one moved, as if afraid that even a breath might shatter the spell still hanging in the air. The audience seemed frozen, eyes glistening, hands pressed to mouths and hearts, some staring at the spot where Morgan had stood as if expecting him to return. Then, slowly, the room came back to life. People turning to one another with watery smiles and shaking heads, words soft and broken, voices hushed with awe. A young woman in the third row reached for the hand of the elderly man beside her, squeezing tightly, and he let out a breathless chuckle, eyes glistening, lips trembling with a smile that didn't quite hide the tear slipping down his cheek. A mother wrapped her arms around her teenage son, pressing a kiss to his hair. Eyes squeezed shut, and he hugged her back, tight and unashamed, eyes red-rimmed and glassy. Strangers turned to each other, some embracing with damp smiles, others dabbing at eyes and cheeks with sleeves and tissues, voices low and rough with unshed tears. Backstage, the crew stared at the monitors, hands hovering uselessly over controls, eyes bright and wide with disbelief. Even the producers, usually so sharp and unflinching, stood motionless, headsets half-slipped, eyes glistening, mouths parted wordlessly. Vanessa hadn't moved from her chair, hands limp in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor, the tear on her cheek drying slowly under the harsh stage lights. Her lips parted, breath shaky, but she didn't speak, couldn't seem to find the words. Her eyes bright and dazed, fingers trembling slightly where they rested on the cue cards now forgotten in her lap. In the silence, Morgan's words seemed to echo, soft but unshakable, a powerful reminder of the impact of a voice steady with age and wisdom. A reminder that true power wasn't in the volume of words but in the weight they carried, in the love and truth woven through them. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room that this wasn't just an interview. It was a lesson, a story that would linger long after the lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the right words at the right time are enough to change everything.